Auburn Tigers at OA Now. OANow.com. You can follow him on Twitter if you would like at Cole Reporter. Adam, appreciate a few minutes of your time this afternoon. I want to start with Hugh Freeze's press conference. And the very first question that was asked, I thought was kind of a fascinating way to begin the press conference after he wished somebody a happy birthday. He was asked about his sideline demeanor. And instead of looking mad or angry, he looked sad and dejected. And his answer to that was kind of rambling. What did you take from that?
Well, truth be told, I actually I was actually out of town to start the week, and so I wasn't in attendance for yesterday. But what I can say on the note of that LSU game was, I know just kind of looking back at that it was, they talked about it being a really embarrassing defeat. And I mean, that was, I think, really true of just that whole game. And I know he even admitted yesterday, too, that just, his players didn't have the right energy at a certain point. I think it was about the time they got down 17-0 that it was just flat. And I mean, you could see that from players. And I think you could certainly see that looking back from him. And I think it's just been, I think a lot of that's a result of this has been a year where I don't think anybody expected them to really fly super high. But at the end of the day, I mean, they've struggled where he, based on his resume, is strongest. And so I think naturally, like, it's just been deflating that they've looked clueless on offense. And I think that naturally that's where a lot of that feeling just kind of stems from.
Adam, I've heard a lot of people and kind of read a lot of people talking about the way Auburn finished the season a year ago with the win over Texas A&M and how they just kind of looked galvanized as a team when Carnell Williams was leading them through the end stretch of that game. They played really hard. They were competitive in games that it looked like they really shouldn't have been competitive in. And a lot of people have said, well, that's how that season ended, and now they're worse. What do we do with that? Because it's obviously a different coaching staff and, in some ways a different team. Does this 2023 Auburn team have that in them in terms of a kind of like, let's see how many cliches I can roll into one, but, the circle the wagons, us against the world, playing at Jordan-Hare, capturing the magic, all of that stuff. Do they have that in them?
So I actually, a really interesting perspective that kind of got brought, to me today that I hadn't really thought about much was thinking back on those last four games under Cadillac. And, I think a lot of the reason that they had so much success last year, I think, you could even say it without mention, but I'd be remiss not to mention it. It's just the fact that, they were playing for somebody who had such a legacy and at Auburn. And it was just sort of a 180 shift if you go from playing for somebody who just never really gelled to somebody who was quintessentially Auburn. And really the biggest thing about sort of last year and the reason they had the success they had was sort of this short-term look that they were kind of playing to win the games that they had left. And if they made a bowl, they made a bowl, but the goal was to win. And I'm sure win for Cadillac and win kind of this, turning it around for Auburn, just sort of the whole tune of the program. And what's been kind of interesting as this year's kind of started and they've had a lack of success on offense is this question of, why don't they go back to that? Why don't they just run the ball and hammer it home? And the thing that I kind of had posed to me today was looking at as far as recruiting and recruiting moving forward. And that's not the brand of football that Hugh Freeze ultimately wants to play and put on the field at Auburn. And to show not that, kind of in recruiting, it just probably isn't something he wants to do. And so I think that's been a really interesting thing as they've kind of struggled. As far as circling the wagons, I guess to get to answering your question, I wouldn't be shocked if they did it. I think the way the schedule sets up, they're kind of coming to the end of this uphill climb, and I think things kind of get a little more downhill moving forward. Of course, you've got Alabama at the end of the year, but you've got New Mexico State before them. That should be darn near a guaranteed win. And Vanderbilt and Mississippi State both look like winnable games. And then, of course, you have Ole Miss at home this weekend. And, Auburn played Georgia what looked like within a touchdown or, within the possibility of winning for about 3 quarters earlier this year at home. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if they turned it around. And It's going to take a lot. They're going to have to look a lot different, but I wouldn't be shocked if they did it.
What about the quarterback thing? Obviously, they bring Peyton Thorne in as a transfer. Robbie Ashford's been there. His issues throwing the football are pretty well documented, but he's also a dynamic athlete. And then Holton Gurnier has, I guess, had some spots this year, but clearly hasn't been enough to jump either of those two guys. Are they to the point where they've got to pick one or the other and just go with it, or are we going to continue to see this kind of rotating quarterbacks and there doesn't necessarily appear to be a rhyme or reason for why they go with a particular player at a particular time?
I think, to pick one and stick with one, I think has been on a lot of people's minds. And kind of going back to sort of what I was talking about in the last answer as far as like not turning to that, just hand the ball off nearly every time and be a really run-heavy offense thing. I don't think they're going to turn to one. Whether that's right or wrong, I think that's up to, the opinions of each individual. But at the end of the day, like, I do think they're going to continue to split the reps. And, Ashford worked really well in the red zone at the start of the year, and I think we saw it in the LSU game that, like, they put him in to start drives and kind of spark things, and they did that at Cal, and it didn't really work. It looked like it worked for about a drive against LSU, and even at that rate, they were probably down multiple scores at that time. And I think the reality is, and that's something that Hughes said earlier this week, is that like they are expecting to still play both quarterbacks against Ole Miss this weekend. My question at this point is I don't know what's going to break the dam hypothetically to where you feel like you have to stick with one. Because at this rate, I mean, things have looked bottomed out so much on offense, and they still haven't changed. So if they haven't changed at this rate, I don't know if or when they will this season, in terms of going to just one quarterback.
Yeah, and the other thing, Adam, this game, it's got some stuff, right? Like some extra stuff. The fact that Hugh Freeze was a coach at Ole Miss, the fact that Auburn made the run at Lane Kiffin in the offseason, and ultimately Hugh Freeze gets the job and all of that. Does any of that matter on the field? Does it only matter to the fans? Does it matter to Hugh Freeze? Is that a factor on Saturday night in your mind?
I think, Hugh actually did give a comment about that earlier this week, and he said that, since he's already, because when he was head coach at Liberty, they played at Ole Miss, and he's already had that, I guess, inaugural reunion, and he said that should lighten the emotions of it a little bit. I would imagine that will take a lot of any hypothetical weight off of this one, but you are right. There's a lot of storylines here between, his past relationship with Ole Miss and his time there and everything that transpired, in terms of Lane Kiffin and Auburn and all those rumors swirling. I think those things they're all very real, of course, but I do think we've reached a point where things have kind of moved down the line so much that I wouldn't expect them to play a huge factor on the field in terms of what's going on in locker room motivation. Who's to really say? But at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to be these massive sort of thoughts in the minds of what's going on with the people on the field.
Last thing for you, Adam. Got about a minute left. Obviously, this gets better for Auburn when the roster gets better. How are things going on the recruiting front? And I ask that knowing full well that it's such a different time in recruiting that maybe that's more difficult to answer than it once was.
Yeah, so it's interesting because you look at, of late, Auburn's had two decommitments lately, both, blue chip defensive back players, Julius Solomon, who he was rumored to be committed to South Carolina, and then it looked like the day he committed, flipped to Auburn, and he decommitted from Auburn and now has since recommitted to South Carolina, and then Jaden Lewis, who's an in-state defensive back prospect, another blue chip, just recently decommitted. Those are kind of the things that, right at the forefront of just what's been going on lately. I think really the biggest thing that's interesting to look at is since he got hired, since his initial press conference, Hugh Freeze has talked about, bringing in an offensive coordinator to call plays, which he's never really done before. And the reason that he did that was so that he could focus on recruiting. And now we're in the thick of this season, halfway through it, and there hasn't really been any offensive success. And so he's discussed at length this struggle of whether or not he needs to take over play calling. And I wouldn't be shocked if that's having some impact on recruiting. But at the end of the day, too, the bar had been so low when he came in, and he's clearing it comfortably, what it was. But I think he knows that, the job isn't necessarily to clear the bar that was there. It's to get the bar back up to where it needs to be. And I don't think it is where it needs to be just yet, but I think that's probably been his biggest focus since he's gotten here. He's talked about, these 24, 25 recruiting classes and how they're probably going to define his tenure at Auburn. So I don't think it's lost on him. And even though there have been a couple losses lately on the recruiting trail, I think it's been probably the biggest focus that he's had since he's gotten here.
Adam, good stuff.